What's going on there, guys? Today we're going to be converting this image taken by Victor Vock of the Cyclist here into this cool drizzly animation, all from using Photomotion Portrait. So as usual, let's boot up Adobe Photoshop and get the ball rolling. Our first step will be to separate this guy from the background, but before we do so, just make sure to create a duplicate from our background layer just over here. A quick disclaimer of course, but just make sure, especially with Portrait, do not get rid of this background layer here. We will need it in After Effects in a bit. Then we'll use the selection tool just to create our first selection from this guy here. Once we have our rough outline made, let's just go up here to select a mask and just get to making our mask that more precise. Remember at this stage to just make sure that our selection is precise as possible. What we'll be doing in After Effects is just using this mask and the background to create a small amount of depth. After we're done, of course, let's just go to output settings just over here and change our output to new layer with mask to plonk this selection into its own layer, and then we'll just hit OK. Right, so let's just bring back our selection by control clicking on the mask here, and then we'll be able to disable this new layer and then select and enable the layer below. What we'll then be doing is just expanding our mask by going over to select, then modify and expand. We'll set the amount here roughly around 15 pixels and then just hit OK. All we need to do is just right click on our selection and then hit fill. We'll then use content aware fill just over here to fill in the blanks of what is exactly behind this guy. Okay, so this isn't too bad and really doesn't require that much work to rebuild this image. So we'll just use the patch tool just over here to get started, and then we'll correct and fix some of these edges here or parts of the clean plate which just don't look exactly A-star. With Portrait, don't worry too much about being perfect. Unlike the other projection systems, there really isn't that much going on in terms of movement between the layers, so more than likely you won't see the majority of what is behind this cyclist. Although in saying that, it does also open you up to options like, say for example, scaling up your background, so obviously do whatever you feel is necessary. Right, so we also wanted to add a few elements, so as you can see here, this is the final result that we wanted to convert into our 3D animation. So we have this text layer over here, decal texture splash behind the cyclist, and one small detail that you'll notice is that the sunglasses reflection is now gone. And there's of course a reason that we'll get into much later within the tutorial. Looks really cool, so let's think about bringing this into After Effects and Photomotion Portrait. Okay, so obviously the first step is to load After Effects via the Photomotion project. So if you've never loaded it before or it's been a while, it may take some time to load, and the reason for that is just cache files being loaded into the system. Right, so as most of you know, Photomotion is of course a viewport based application, so most of our work will be done inside this viewport and effect controls. In saying that, let's just hit start portrait and get the ball rolling. Right, so when we're greeted with the main dashboard, we have no option here but just to click on the add photo button down here, and when we do so, we can just sling our Photoshop file into this project and all the additional assets that we'll need. So when we get to this screen, just make sure that your import kind is set to composition so all of your layers and elements don't merge back into one, and then just hit OK. Now all of our layers will appear in the project panel just over here, so let's get to importing in our default background layer. Remember the one that you created a duplicate from in the start, and just drag it down into our composition. We'll then parent it to this layer on top whilst holding shift and then scale the layer above in order to have all of these attributes be easily applied universally throughout our project. Don't worry, it will make sense in a bit. Okay, so once this is scaled accordingly, let's go to sorting out our face mesh by going back to the main dashboard and selecting the set face 1 button. What we'll want to do here is using the corners and the central controller, get this face mesh to match his facial features as close as possible. Don't worry about the shoulders just yet, we'll be fixing those in a second. So once we're happy, navigate over to effect controls over here and tick this enable tweak checkbox, and within our viewport you'll see a new button called tweak become available. So let's go over there and just double click on this. So what we'll be doing within this area is just fitting our face mesh a little bit better using some of the more advanced features. First, let's go over here and select this tweak this layer, and then in effect controls you should see all of these new options become available. So what we'll want to do here is just select this mesh warp effect over here in order to bring up all of these points. Now by grabbing each intersection we can better mold our mesh into fitting this guy a bit better, and once we're happy, let's grab the liquify tool just over here, adjust our brush size, and then look at adjusting the mesh details a little further by pushing the ears, face, and of course shoulders further into position. So back in the main dashboard, let's look at importing in our masks. First, of course, make sure that you are using the selection tool before clicking on any of the buttons. Okay, so go to this button down here, add mask, and then click on import, and finally what we'll do is drag our layer 1, this Cyclist masked out into this composition and parent it to the layer above whilst holding shift. That'll just copy all of our attributes from the background layer into this one. Next, we'll just jump into this add background button and do exactly the same of what we did with our layer beforehand. Throw it in, parent it holding shift, and voila, that's all of our layers set. If you look at the main dashboard now, we can see that there's a slight parallax effect with the background, and that's because our subject is now separate from that background in his own independent layer. It's a subtle effect, but it really goes the distance. Okay, so into the most complicated part of the tutorial, which is painting in our depth map. First, double click on this edit depth button in the main dashboard to get started. Within this composition, we'll see a representation of our face mesh in a depth map with the white parts being close to the camera and the darker areas being pushed further to the back. First things first, let's click on this layer down here, making sure that your playhead is at the very beginning. You'll see within effect controls, now there's a few more options that have become available. Ignore those for a second, let's just click on the brush tool and double click on the viewport to bring up what we're painting. So let's just quickly tweak the paint image layer opacity so that we can see exactly what we're painting on, and what we'll want to do is set our brush to white with a flow around 5%. We'll also increase our brush diameter as well and start painting in parts which our face mesh doesn't know about. Say for example like the helmet, a little bit more of these shoulders, and just pad out the face a little bit further. If you look over here, however, you'll see that obviously his sunglasses aren't properly covered within the depth mask. We could of course try and paint this in, but of course because of the nature of the shades and the way they're shaped, having rigid edges and the fact that they're on top of our eyes and nose, where our mesh has some depth definition to it, when it comes down to the main animation, it will look a little bit funky if we do things that way. So if we go back to the face mesh composition, the one that we set up earlier, and next to the tweak button, we have this button called objects, and we're going to double click on that to get access to this composition. First things first, let's click on this layer 1 within the composition here, and then with this layer selected, equip the pen tool. So what we'll then do is just zoom in a bit, make sure that layer 1 is selected, and then mask out these shades here. So you won't really notice anything because we haven't enabled this object, so let's get to that now by clicking on the activate checkbox within effect controls. What that will do is just convert the background into our depth map and turn our mask black and white. Obviously in this state it's not that useful, so let's click on the fill checkbox and that will fill in this mask as a grey object. We'll then need to finite this in order to ensure that it fits within our image and the depth, so go to color 1 target and select the center of the glasses here, as that's the point that's closest to the camera. We'll then change the brightness of color 1 and make this grey a little bit more lighter in order to make sure that it fits within the same depth as the nose here. Now that's still not exactly ideal because we're not going to see any depth difference here. What we really want is a gradient from white to black, just like what we have here with the depth map on our face mesh. So select color 2 target and place it roughly to the back of the masked object here, in this case it's close to the ears, and then bring down this brightness. What that will do is create a contrast between our 2 points, or gradient if you will, so that when this object is interpreted as a 3D object, we'll see a difference in depth similar to that of what we're seeing with the depth map on the face mesh. So you might need to move the point a bit, but you should end up with an object that looks a little bit like this. Our next step will be to add a little bit more feather with our mask here, as depth maps really don't play well with rigid edges, and if we let it be, it will probably create a distortion or two, which obviously we don't want. So when you get a result that generally blends in with the depth map like ours does, you're in the right place. So if we go back to where we were painting earlier and bring down the paint overlay, we can see that our shades are now on top of the depth map created by our face mesh. Okay, now that we're happy and in the main dashboard, let's look to creating an animation. Let's grab the controller here, swing it to the left, and then we're going to first change our frame count to time by going over to the frame count just over here and control clicking on it. Then we'll move our playhead roughly along the 5 seconds point and make sure to keep a note of this, as we will need this information later. Okay, with that done, let's move our controller to the right in order to create a simple animation here. With that done, just hit N to mark the end of our workspace here and keep things crystal in terms of our animation length. In order to change our beginning point, all we need to do is move the playhead back to the beginning where these keyframes are and just tweak the movement to where we want it. So let's preview what we have here quickly, and we can really tell that the object and depth map worked out really quite well. We'll keep this animation rather quite simple, as the more complicated it is, the vastly more time consuming it is when we get to adding that reflection and decal into the animation. Right, so let's look at adding some more life and immersion into the scene by adding in some particles. Go to the settings button on the main dashboard over here, and then what we're going to do is just change the particle type to number 11, rain, and then click on this activate particles checkbox. Now the rain isn't quite popping as much as as we'd like, so let's have them pop a little bit more by changing the curve to alpha and then bring up these highlights, which will make them slightly more prominent within our scene. So you can also see that we have some negative space here just next to our image, and we can do a variety of things to fix that. So let's just click on the background button on the main dashboard and then go over to effect controls. First, let's just increase the depth between the cyclist here and the background in order to separate the pair of them a little bit more. Then we're going to give the background some extra scale to get rid of some of that negative space. Looking good. So if we scan around, we can see that our background is fixed for now, and there's quite a lot of separation going on between our cyclist here and the background. But this image could still be a little bit more interesting, so let's get adding some rotation to the overall 3D setup and make it a little bit more dynamic. We can do this by just going over to this animation button on the main dashboard, and then all we need to do is just drag along this rotation boost, which will rotate the overall 3D setup within our project. We could also add this tile edges, which will mirror out our edges within our background. Okay, so we could stick to this, but we have a few tricks up our sleeves in order to make it somewhat more interesting. So let's remove all of the effects, including the rotation, and jump to the background layer. What we're going to do within the background layer, the place where we added in our clean plate, not the add photo layer, is just add this decal or brush stroke into the background of our animation. So let's just drag this decal into this layer. Then we're going to hold shift and parent it to the layer on top here in order to make sure that it's proportionately scaled with the rest of our image here. Just select the Photoshop layer or the decal you just imported into this composition, and then press P to bring up its core positioning attributes. Then with your playhead at the very beginning of the composition, click the stopwatch icon just over here. Right, so let's animate some positioning here by dragging it along the X axis. And then what we're going to do is just move our playhead to the 5 seconds point. Now, why are we moving it 5 seconds along? So if you remember earlier, that's actually the length of our overall animation. So once we're happy with this animation, highlight both keyframes and hit F9 on your keyboard. What that will do is just convert them to easing. What we're going to try and do here is make it seem like this guy here and the decal and the reflection in the glasses, we'll get to that in a minute, are moving relative to the animation, so while the camera moves, they in fact stay in place. Cool, so let's look to matching some of these darker areas with a foreground by going over to background and then over to curves here. We'll then dip them ever so slightly to make sure that everything in the background is a little less faded. Right, so what we want to do now is just add that little bit of reflection that you can see in the glasses with the main animation. Let's get to doing that now, and what we'll need to do is go to the add photo composition, the composition we first accessed when we dropped off the unseparated image at the very beginning. So we have here this image of a forest, and we'll bring this into the composition, and of course no need to parent it as we'll be scaling it purely independently. Right, so you can see that it's kind of just sitting on top, not really doing that much, but that's fine for now because we're just going to disable it and get to creating a custom shape layer. Of course, really important, just make sure that you've got none of these layers selected. Then we're going to get a good view of this guy's glasses and select the pen tool, and we're just going to create this custom shape on top of his glasses. Right, so while we're at it, just make sure that your fill is solid and to remove the stroke here. Nothing left to do but just start creating a custom shape. Okay, so let's just change the opacity quickly to make our lives a little bit easier, and when we're finished, we'll just bring this opacity back up. So what we also want to do is just make sure that our sunglasses layer is just below the shape layer we just created. So make sure to drag the shape layer just under any other layers, making sure that the two are adjacent. Okay, so now just click on the sunglasses reflection layer over here, the layer we just added a moment ago, and change it to alpha matte. If you don't see this option, click on this icon down here to reveal it, and then with the shape layer above the sunglasses image, click on the track matte of the image with the reflection that we want and change it to alpha matte. Make sure to swap out to the selection tool, and then you can either move it from the viewport or from the layer's positioning attributes, so it fits just under the sunglasses here, nice and snug. Right, so with the shape layer selected, what we're going to do is apply a fast box blur here by typing it out within the effects panel and then bringing that blur radius up so it softens the edges of this shape layer. Then we're going to select the sunglasses image layer and use the hue saturation effect to remove all of the saturation so it's just black and white. And then we're going to apply some levels here and really bring up the input black. Okay, so looking really good so far, but a little bit too poignant within our image, so let's just change the opacity of the sunglasses reflection and bring it back a tad. So if we enable and disable this layer, you can really see the difference. We'll also look at animating its position so it seems a little bit more dynamic within our animation. So let's get to the sunglasses reflection layer, press P in order to bring up the positioning attributes, and then click on the stopwatch icon just over here to begin animating. What we'll then do is just bring this needle to the 5 seconds point, as that's the end of our animation, and of course we'll mark out from there. We'll then move the positioning slightly to the left, and you can see the effect effect if we scan around with our needle. Okay, so just one thing, make sure to highlight both keyframes, then hit F9 on your keyboard in order to convert them to easing. Right, so remember when I mentioned at the very beginning about the reflection from the Cyclist and how we removed it in Photoshop? This is the reason why. So if we bring in the first layer, just the Cyclist separated from the background, and position his layer below the sunglasses and the shape layer, and finally parent it to the layer at the very top whilst holding shift, you can now see that there's no reflection here, and that's evident when we enable and disable this layer. So all that needs to be done is just to enable your sunglasses layer, and now we have a rather quite nice reflection going on with the road beyond. Right, so back at the main dashboard, let's just see how that's all working out. If we preview the animation, we can see that this decor and the road animate really quite well. They look like they're sticking in relative position as our camera animates around. Small detail, but it helps really bring that extra layer of immersion and really bring this image to life. Right, so this image is next to done more or less. Let's just make sure to change the export resolution to 4K, and we could do that by just going over to the resolution button just over here and changing this 1080p to 4K within effect controls. We'll then export this out by clicking on the export button on the main dashboard. Now, there is one final thing we'd like to add here. So if you remember to the beginning, we also had this text layer just over here. So the best place to really add it in is just within this composition here. So we'll just take it from the project tab, drag it into this composition, and then just scale it accordingly so it fits roughly in the place that it did so in Photoshop. Then what we'll do is just have it react in a similar fashion to how the reflection and the deck were moving, just moving it slightly to the right. We'll then select both the keyframes and then convert them to easing, so of course it matches the other animations within the project. If you see here with our time head at the 5 seconds point at the end of our animation, we're getting a green light from Photomotion Perfect Cut System. What this 150 basically means is that when our needle is at the 150 frame point, we have a green light to render this animation without any loops whatsoever. Since we're looking at time, it's not really that clear, so let's go over to the time code, change it to frame count over here, and then we can see this a little bit more clearly. So if we really wanted to, we could bring our time head to the 300 frames for 2 loops, then mark out, or 600 frames, 3 loops, mark out, and then so on and so on and so on. But for now, we'll just stick to no loops. So we could render this out directly through After Effects, but what if we wanted to render out an MP4? Unfortunately, at the time of this recording, After Effects sadly lacks the ability to export out in that codec. Quite frustrating, but we can still bring this into Adobe Media Encoder via the dynamic link by going over to Composition and then add to Adobe Media Encoder queue. What that will do is just bring us into Media Encoder, and before we even think about clicking on the render button, play button at the very top, just make sure that your format is set to H.264 and your output is somewhere that's convenient for you. From that point, just hit the render button and of course, you're good to go. And of course, there you have it from start to finish. Looks really cool, but this is only a tutorial and we want to hear what you guys are up to. Let us know via the live chat if you have any questions whatsoever, and as usual, take it easy and until next time.